Washington, D.C., March 1965. The White House State Dinner glowed with chandeliers and ambition. President Lyndon Johnson moved through the East Room like a man who owned not just the building but the very air inside it. He was tall, commanding, a force of nature in a tailored suit. And when he saw Dean Martin across the room, his face split into that famous Texas grin. The president extended his hand. Dean took it. What happened in the next 7 seconds would haunt the Secret Service for months. The grip was wrong. That's what Agent Thomas Kellerman wrote in his report 3 hours later, sitting in a windowless office with his hands still shaking. The grip was wrong, the angle was wrong, the duration was wrong. Dean Martin, one of the most beloved entertainers in America, had shaken the president's hand in a way that deviated from protocol by exactly 43 degrees and held it for 2.6 seconds longer than acceptable range. Kellerman had clocked it. He clocked everything. That was his job. And his job had just become significantly more complicated. Dean didn't know any of this. He smiled, made a joke about the president's height, something about needing a ladder to look him in the eye. Johnson laughed. The room laughed. Then Dean moved on to speak with Lady Bird, charming as always, that easy grace that made him seem like the most natural thing in any room he entered. He performed that night, sang 3 songs accompanied by the Marine Band, his voice pouring out smooth and effortless as aged bourbon. He made the president laugh twice more. He made the First Lady blush. By all accounts, the evening was a triumph. 3 days later, Dean was in Las Vegas rehearsing at the Sands when a man in a dark suit appeared backstage. His name was Robert Henshaw, Deputy Director of Presidential Security Detail. He didn't look like trouble. He looked like an accountant. But when he asked if Dean had a few minutes to talk, there was something in his eyes that suggested the question wasn't really a question at all. They sat in Dean's dressing room. Henshaw declined the offered drink. He placed a leather folder on the table between them and opened it with practiced precision. Inside were photographs. Dean at the White House. Dean shaking the president's hand. Dean from 6 different angles, captured by cameras Dean had never seen. And beside each photograph, handwritten notes in tight, methodical script. "Mr. Martin," Henshaw said, his voice quiet and precise, "I need to ask you about your training." Dean lit a cigarette, took his time with it. "My training?" "Yes, sir. Specifically, any training you may have received in close quarters combat, weapons handling, or covert operations during your military service." Dean exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. He'd been drafted in 1944, served stateside, worked in special services entertaining troops. He'd held a rifle maybe twice. "I sang," he said. "That was my training. I sang for boys who were shipping out." "That was it." Henshaw made a note. "The way you positioned yourself when approaching the president. The angle of your approach. The specific manner in which you established physical contact. These things suggest a different kind of training entirely." The room got very quiet. Outside, someone was running scales on a piano, the notes climbing and falling like a question being asked over and over. Dean studied Henshaw's face. The man believed what he was saying. That was the remarkable thing. He genuinely believed that Dean Martin, a kid from Steubenville, Ohio, who'd started out as a boxer and a card dealer, who'd learned to sing because singing paid better than getting punched, was some kind of covert operative. "You think I'm a threat," Dean said. "Not a question. A statement." "I think you're an unknown variable," Henshaw replied. "Which, in my line of work, amounts to the same thing." Dean could have laughed. Should have laughed. But something in Henshaw's earnestness stopped him. This man had driven to Las Vegas, had prepared this presentation, had devoted what looked like dozens of hours to analyzing a handshake. He was afraid. Not of Dean, exactly. Of the possibility that his vigilance had failed, that something had slipped past him, that the president had been vulnerable for 7 seconds and he hadn't acted. "I grew up in a tough neighborhood," Dean said finally. My old man was a barber. My brother was a boxer, a good one. You learn certain things when you grow up like that. How to carry yourself. How to shake a man's hand so he knows you respect him but you're not afraid of him. That's all it was. Respect without fear. That's how you shake any man's hand worth shaking. Henshaw wrote this down. He wrote everything down. Then he looked up, and for the first time, something human flickered across his face. The president liked you very much, he said. He's invited you back. 2 more events this year. State dinner in June, a reception in September. And you want me to decline. I want you to understand the position this puts us in. Every person who gets within arm's reach of the president is a calculated risk. We calculate those risks very carefully. We account for variables. But you, Mr. Martin, you're someone the entire nation trusts. That makes you the perfect weapon if someone wanted to use you that way. Dean stubbed out his cigarette. He thought about his kids, about his ex-wife, about Jean who he'd married 2 years ago, about all the people in his life who'd ever looked at him and seen exactly what they wanted to see. Drunken Dean. Easy Dean. Dean who didn't care about anything except the next laugh, the next drink, the next song. He'd built that image carefully, protected it like a man protects his family. And now this man in his dark suit was telling him the image had worked too well, that he'd become invisible even when he was the most visible person in the room. I'm not declining, Dean said. The President of the United States invites me to dinner, I go. That's not negotiable. Henshaw closed his folder. Then we'll need to establish protocols. What followed was 6 weeks of the most surreal experience of Dean's life, and he'd shared a stage with a live chimpanzee. Henshaw and 2 other agents came to Las Vegas once a week. They observed Dean's movements, his patterns, his habits. They timed how long it took him to walk from his dressing room to the stage. They documented his preferred routes through crowds. They interviewed his staff, his musicians, his security. They wanted to know everything, and they approached the task with the grim thoroughness of men defusing a bomb. Frank thought it was hilarious. They think you're a spy, he said one night at the bar, laughing so hard he nearly spilled his Jack Daniels. You. A spy. You can't even keep track of your golf clubs. Sammy was more thoughtful. It's because you're good at being underestimated, he said. That's your gift, Dean. People look at you and think they've got you figured out, and that makes them comfortable. But underneath, you're always watching. Always thinking. I've seen it. They've seen it too. It scares them. The second White House dinner was on June 18. Dean arrived early, as instructed. Henshaw met him at a side entrance, walked him through the security procedures that had been implemented specifically for his visit. Metal detectors, pat-downs, a 5-minute conversation with a psychologist who asked him about his stress levels and recent mood changes. Dean endured it all with the same patient grace he brought to everything else, but something was changing inside him. He was starting to understand the weight these men carried, the impossible mathematics of keeping one man safe in a country where anyone could be anyone. The president found him before dinner, pulled him aside into the blue room. Johnson looked tired in a way the cameras never showed. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there in March. Vietnam was eating him alive, though the worst was still to come. Dean, Johnson said, and his voice carried the Texas warmth that made you want to believe him even when you knew better. They're giving you trouble, aren't they? My boys. My watchdogs. They're doing their job, Mr. President. Their job is to make me paranoid about every person I meet. That's no way to live. I won't have it. You understand me? I won't have it. Dean understood. He understood that this was both a statement and a question, that Johnson was asking him to affirm that friendship and trust still meant something in a world that was coming apart at the seams. He understood that the president was lonely, isolated in a way that fame had never made Dean feel, because Dean could always walk away from it, but Johnson couldn't, not for 3 more years, maybe 7 if he won again. "I understand, sir." They shook hands. Johnson pulled him close, the way politicians do, and embraced disguised as a handshake. Dean felt the strength in those hands, the desperation too. When they separated, Dean saw Henshaw across the room, watching, his face an unreadable mask. The dinner went smoothly. Dean sang "Everybody Loves Somebody," the song that had knocked the Beatles off the #1 spot the previous summer, a fact that still amazed him. He was 50 years old, ancient by rock and roll standards, but the song had connected with people in a way he hadn't expected. Maybe they were tired of screaming teenagers and mop-top hair. Maybe they wanted something that felt like it had been around forever, solid and reliable. Maybe they just wanted to believe that everybody did love somebody sometime, that loneliness wasn't the only truth. September 23rd was cooler, autumn settling into Washington like an exhaled breath. The reception was smaller, more intimate, a celebration for the passage of some education bill that Dean hadn't followed closely. He arrived on time, went through the security procedures without complaint, smiled at the psychologist who was starting to feel like an old friend. Henshaw was there, always there, a shadow that never quite touched Dean but never left him either. Die in the receiving line. Dean shook the president's hand again. He'd thought about this moment for weeks, wondered if he should make a point, prove something, show Henshaw and his team that he could do it their way, by the book, no deviations. But when his hand met Johnson's, muscle memory took over. The same grip. The same angle. The same duration, maybe a second longer because Johnson's eyes held a question Dean felt compelled to answer with presence, with solidarity, with the simple affirmation that he was still here, still willing to stand in this impossible position between suspicion and trust. Henshaw didn't move. He watched. But Dean saw something flicker across his face, a resignation, or maybe an acceptance. The agent had spent 6 months trying to fit Dean into a category, to make him predictable, controllable, safe. And Dean, simply by being himself, by refusing to perform the version of himself that would make everyone comfortable, had forced Henshaw to confront an uncomfortable truth. The world wasn't safe. People weren't predictable. And sometimes the greatest threat came not from those who wished harm but from those who destroyed trust in the name of preventing it. After the reception, Henshaw found Dean in the corridor. They stood together in the indirect light from the sconces, 2 men from different worlds who'd been forced to see each other clearly. "I'm closing your file," Henshaw said. "Officially, you're no longer under observation." Dean nodded. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes, sir." "Did you ever really think I was a threat? Or were you just afraid of not knowing?" Henshaw took his time answering. "I think," he said slowly, "that you represent something I'm not trained to protect against. You make people feel safe. You make them let their guard down. In my world, that's dangerous. But I'm starting to understand that it's also necessary. The president needs people he can trust to be exactly what they appear to be. That's a rare thing." I mistook it for deception. They shook hands. It was brief, professional, the way men shake hands when the moment calls for formality. But Dean felt the apology in it, unspoken but real, and he accepted it the way he'd accepted everything else, with grace. Dean never told this story publicly. It lived in Secret Service files, in Henshaw's reports, in the memories of a few agents who worked the details of those 3 events. But it changed something in how the service approached their work. Henshaw went on to train a new generation of agents, and in those sessions, he told them about the singer who shook the president's hand wrong. Not as a cautionary tale but as a reminder that their job was to protect without destroying, to be vigilant without becoming paranoid, to understand that trust was both the most vulnerable and the most necessary thing any president could possess. Years later, after Johnson left office, after Dean had become even more successful, after the Rat Pack had dissolved and reformed and dissolved again, Henshaw sent Dean a letter. It was brief. It said that he'd spent a lot of time thinking about those handshakes, about what it meant to hold on to dignity and authenticity in a world that demanded conformity and suspicion. He thanked Dean for teaching him something about the difference between security and safety, between protection and imprisonment. He said he hoped Dean understood that the investigation had never been personal, that it was the system, not the man, that had created the conflict between them. Dean never responded to the letter. But he kept it. It sat in a drawer in his dressing room at the Sands for years, a reminder that even the smallest gestures carried weight, that the way you touched another human being mattered, that grace under scrutiny was its own form of courage. When Dean died in 1995, that letter was among his personal effects. His daughter Deanna found it while sorting through his things, read it twice trying to understand what it meant, why her father had kept it. She asked people who'd known him if they remembered anything about this, but no one did. It was one more mystery about a man who'd made mystery his brand, who'd convinced the world he was simple so they'd never see how deep he really was. The truth is that Dean Martin understood something fundamental about power and vulnerability. He understood that the most dangerous thing you can do in a fearful world is refuse to be afraid. Not through bravado or aggression, but through the quiet insistence on remaining human, on treating every interaction as an opportunity for connection rather than calculation. When he shook the president's hand, he wasn't making a statement about politics or protocol. He was simply doing what he'd always done, offering another human being the gift of being seen, being valued, being met with respect and warmth regardless of what the moment demanded. The Secret Service saw a threat because they were trained to see threats. They saw deviation from protocol and imagined assassination. They saw familiarity and imagined conspiracy. What they couldn't see, what took months of investigation to reveal, was that Dean Martin was exactly what he appeared to be. A man who sang. A man who made people laugh. A man who shook hands the way his father had taught him, firm and honest, looking the other person in the eye, holding on long enough to maintain in a world that increasingly valued performance over authenticity, calculation over spontaneity. Dean's refusal to adjust himself to make others comfortable was revolutionary. He forced those around him, including federal agents with guns and badges and the authority to destroy careers, to examine their own assumptions. He made them ask whether their systems of protection had become systems of isolation, whether their vigilance had become paranoia, whether they were keeping the president safe or just keeping him alone. History remembers Dean Martin as an entertainer. The voice. The jokes. The drinks, real or staged. The effortless cool that made him a symbol of a particular kind of American masculinity, unflappable and amused by the chaos around him. But the files buried in National Archives contain another story, a footnote about the day security protocols changed because one man insisted on being human, on treating the most powerful person in the world as just another person worth knowing, worth respecting, worth holding onto for a few extra seconds because that's what you do when you meet someone who matters. The handshake lasted 7 seconds. The investigation lasted 6 months. The lesson lasted a lifetime. And somewhere in that equation is everything you need to know about Dean Martin, about dignity, about the courage it takes to remain yourself when the world insists you become what it needs you to be. He sang for presidents and working men. He shook hands with power and never blinked. And when they tried to make him small enough to fit their categories, he simply refused, quietly and completely, until they had no choice but to expand their understanding to include him. That's the real threat Dean Martin posed. Not violence. Not deception. But the possibility that we might all be more than the boxes we've been assigned, that authenticity matters more than safety, that the hand extended in genuine human warmth is the most radical act in a frightened world. The Secret Service eventually understood this. It took them months. But they got there. And in getting there, they became better at their jobs, better at balancing protection with humanity, better at understanding that the president they guarded needed more than physical safety. He needed to remain human too. He needed handshakes that meant something. He needed Dean Martin to be Dean Martin, undiminished and unafraid.